Now we'll discuss the 1960s. The 1960s are really defined, at least early on, the early part of the 60s politically, by the election of John F. Kennedy in 1960. In his election, or in that election, he was his challenger was Richard Nixon. If you remember, going back, that was Eisenhower's vice president, and it was really two contrasting styles, two contrasted people. You had Nixon, who was the kind of the traditional old school politician, not old, but just kind of very conservative, and also he was also, if you remember the McCarthy hearings, he was kind of involved in that and leaned towards kind of the McCarthy point of view. And Kennedy was a young up and comer, a war veteran, a war hero, came from a very wealthy, prominent family, and was good looking and all those things, and so it was going to be a close election no matter what. But what really defines this election and what makes it important historically is the fact that it was they had the first televised debate between presidential candidates, and it's very interesting. People to this day, people who work on campaigns and campaign managers and political scientists, they study this debate because of how it turned out and the fact that it was televised. Basically, Nixon had been somewhat ill leading up to the debate, and so he didn't look well. He looked kind of tired, and he shaved that morning, but didn't shave again, and he was he grew a thick beard, so he had kind of what they call a 5 o'clock shadow on his face, and word is he refused to put on much, if any, makeup for the televised debate. Kennedy, on the other hand, had vacationed prior to the debate, had a tan, was feeling good, and his handlers understood the value, and he understood the value of how you look on television, and he accepted the use of makeup and all those things. And basically, he looked a lot better than Nixon. And so they had the debate. Of course, the debate back then, it was on television and it was on radio. So people listened on the radio and people watched on television. And those that watched on television, in polling done after the debate, said that Kennedy won. Those that listened to it on the radio said that Nixon won. And so basically, it told people, or told those that specialize in these debates or study them, that how you look matters, your appearance matters, maybe more so than what you actually say. And this is an important revelation as far as the power of television and the priorities when you do present yourself on television in a debate and in other things. So, but anyway, Kennedy wins the election. A very, very close election. It's one of the closest elections in American presidential history. And so he comes into the office, as this young, vibrant young man with a beautiful wife, Jackie, his wife Jackie Kennedy, and two cute little kids. And the people he surrounded, and of course the later on, as they are in there, they will be called Camelot would be the term used for the Kennedy presidency. But the people he hired, this is important. The people he put around him were not the traditional old politicians. Traditionally, it had been kind of the common theme to, if you're going to fill a cabinet position, you would pull somebody out of the Senate or the House of Representatives to work for you. Well, Kennedy decided he was going to look elsewhere. He was going to look into academia, and he hired people in his cabinet and his advisors, people from Harvard and Yale, and more academic types. Notably, his Secretary of Defense, one of the Secretaries of Defense, John McNamara, was a young businessman, a brilliant man, but the former CEO of Ford Motor Company, and so he tended to try to seek out very smart people and kind of people that thought outside of the box. And then he talked about what his vision for the presidency and his vision for America. And he talked about a new frontier, about doing things that hadn't been done before. And of course, most famously, probably he'll call for landing on the moon and sending Americans to the moon. Uh, Now, overall, and just in general, we'll talk more about Kenny in a little bit, but his record was mediocre. I mean, he got a lot of the fact that he will be assassinated puts him down in presidential lore, in mythology, and but if you look at it in reality, his record wasn't that good. I mean, he had some domestic successes and some foreign policy successes, but he had failures on both sides too. So, like many presidents, there was good and bad. Now, if you remember, Earl Warren was appointed as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court by Eisenhower prior to Kennedy, and under his court, there were some pretty significant civil liberties advances, including the cases of Gideon versus Wainwright and Miranda versus Arizona. These Supreme Court cases changed a lot of the ways in which the defendant, the person that's charged with a crime, expanded their rights and protections against the power of government. In Gideon versus Wainwright, the Gideon fellow was a kind of a ne'er-do-well, a bum, kind of a not a very we might call him homeless today, but he just he had a kind of a short or pretty significant criminal record, and he was arrested for a pretty significant crime, and he was put on trial. Now, at this time, the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution that guarantees the right to an attorney, basically back then it was interpreted as you have the right to an attorney if you can afford it, and the government can't prevent you from getting an attorney. It doesn't guarantee you a lawyer or an attorney. So Gideon was convicted, obviously, because he had the prosecutor and the state was prosecuting him, and he had to defend himself because he couldn't afford a lawyer. So he was in prison, and like many prisoners do, he went to the prison library, and he started reading up on the Constitution and law, and finally he came to the conclusion that he kind of got screwed out of this deal, the fact that he didn't have a lawyer. His interpretation was that the Fifth Amendment guaranteed a lawyer, and that is fundamentally how it should be. So he started handwriting appeals to the Supreme Court. Usually there's a general process of getting your case into the Supreme Court, and it's very convoluted and difficult. The Supreme Court doesn't hear that many cases. And writing your own, as a non-lawyer, writing your own brief to the court is not going to get it there. But he kept writing it and refining his argument until eventually, I don't know if the Supreme Court got tired of the letters, but they decided to hear his case. And eventually, they ruled in his favor that not only does the Fifth Amendment guarantee that the government cannot prevent you from having a lawyer, it actually guarantees that everybody will receive at least some kind of legal assistance from a lawyer. Now, it may not be the best, but it will be what's called a public defender, which means it'll be an attorney that's paid by the court and will defend you, at least give you legal advice. So Gideon versus Wainwright. The other is Miranda versus Arizona, and this Miranda fellow, he was arrested after committing a pretty horrible crime. And as the police were speaking to him and asking him questions, he just basically admitted everything. He admitted everything, and of course that was used against him in court, and he was convicted and put in prison. Well, he had a good lawyer, and the lawyer started questioning the period where the police were asking him questions, and he was answering them. And he noted that the Fifth Amendment allows you to not be a witness against yourself, meaning you don't have to answer questions that if you don't want to as a defendant. Pleading the Fifth basically is what that is. If you plead the Fifth, that means you don't have to answer questions because the state or the government has to prove their case. You don't have to help them. And so the lawyer said, basically, when the police were asking him his questions, he didn't have to answer them. But then they said, well, he didn't know that he had that right not to answer questions. And so the big question arises here is that if you don't know you have, First Amendment rights or Fifth Amendment rights, if you don't know you have them, does that mean you lose them? And the Supreme Court ruled no, that the fact that Miranda didn't know that he had the right to remain silent basically didn't mean he lost the right to remain silent. And so now, after this ruling, and of course his conviction was overturned because the confession was overturned. So basically after this, now that is why every time you see a movie, if you've gotten arrested, or in any movie you watch where somebody gets arrested, they handcuff the person and then they tell them, you have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be held against you in the court of law, da-da-da-da-da. And that's the Miranda warning. And so it was this case. And basically, you have to tell people that you arrest as a police officer that, what their rights are. Also in the 60s, civil rights under Kennedy. Kennedy's hesitancy on civil rights. Well, Kennedy had a problem. He's a Democrat, and he needs Congress and a Democratic majority in Congress to pass anything he wants to do. But the problem is that, the Northern Democrats embrace, civil rights. Most of them are, working towards greater civil rights. And most Democratic presidents, including Truman and Eisenhower, kind of moved forward and progressed on civil rights. But in order to get legislation passed, he needed the Southern Democrats too. And the Southern Democrats were conservative Democrats. And they liked their segregation, and they liked their society as it was. And so Kennedy didn't want to anger the Southern Democrats, so he never really pushed civil rights, even though his brother, Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General, was a very big proponent of civil rights and tried to push John F. Kennedy into a more progressive stance. It didn't work. And so early on in his presidency, especially, Kennedy, held back on overtly pushing for civil rights in order not to offend and lose the Southern Democrats. But then many things happened in the early 60s that kind of led to changing his mind. First, you started seeing widespread protests. Not only Martin Luther King and his protests, but a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. It was basically a group of college students throughout the South who would have sit-ins at places that were segregated. So you'd have black college students going to a lunch counter or a cafe where they were supposedly only serving white people at the counter. Well, they would sit at the counter and ask to be served, and then, of course, they wouldn't be served, but they would continue to stay there to protest, nonviolent protest, civil disobedience, in order to, to highlight the injustice of the laws. And of course, they were oftentimes attacked, abused, verbally abused, physically abused, had drinks, condiments poured on them. But the point was to highlight in a nonviolent way the injustice of these segregation laws. And then, of course, freedom riders. You had segregated buses back in the Deep South, and the freedom riders would get on buses in the North or in the Upper South and ride together, blacks and whites, into the Deep South. And of course, those buses were oftentimes attacked and firebombed. And it was actually a burning of one of those buses simply because it was an integrated bus that led Kennedy to get involved and actually call the governor, I believe it was of Mississippi, to do something about it. Then the integration of the University of Mississippi. Of course, the Supreme Court had ruled that but even before, had eventually ruled that higher education must be integrated. That black students must also have access to higher education, and basically called for the legally desegregated University of Mississippi. But no black student had entered yet. But a black student attempted to enter and enroll in 1962, and basically the university rioted. The whites at the university that were adamantly against immigration created riots, and I believe there's actually one person killed and many injured, and it was just kind of crazy, just from the fact that somebody was trying to enroll in school. And then televised attacks. In one of Martin Luther King's marches, um, that was being televised or recorded. It showed peaceful protesters just walking down the street, being attacked by German shepherds, being sprayed with fire hoses, beaten with clubs, basically for walking down the street. And then King's letter from Birmingham jail. It's one of the most famous, at least in my mind, one of the most important documents in American history. Probably one of the top five, because in it he's he'd been getting letters from religious leaders throughout the country, you know, telling him that they, understand what he's doing, but they wish he would slow down. They wish he would stop causing so much trouble. That they wish he would, delay and not push so hard for immediate, into civil rights discrimination and all these things. And basically, his letter is a response to them, and he wrote it while he was in jail, because King was one of those leaders that he didn't, he wouldn't just tell people to go out and march and face harm and jail. He would do it with them. But anyway, he wrote this letter in response. Basically, in it, he describes why there's no time to wait, why it's not appropriate to stand by and allow this to continue. And he uses descriptions of, from his own life, talking about, what it's like to walk by, an amusement park or something with your 7-year-old daughter, and she wants to go in, and you have to tell her that she can't go in because, you're not a white child, you're a black child, so you can't get to do these things. Or he talks about how, how would you feel? Do I need to stand around and wait while my wife or my mother is disrespected and called all kinds of terrible names, right in front of me? And so he, it's a very personal letter, and it really it's a long letter, and he goes into great detail. But I think it's something that everybody should read, because it's important from his point of view. So with all these things in 60, 61, 62, and 63, Kennedy finally, through pressure from civil rights groups, pressure from Northern Democrats, he finally endorses civil rights legislation. He finally endorses and supports federal laws that end discrimination. And then about this time, too, of course, kind of highlighting all of it is the Civil Rights March on Washington, where King gives his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Here's as you can see in this electoral map, it's very, very close. While Kennedy wins the Electoral College by a fairly significant amount, 84 votes or so, he barely wins the popular vote. And so anyway, it's a very mixed map. There, regionally, it's, as you can see, the brownish color, those are Democrats. And of course, Kennedy wins the South, basically, with the exception of Florida. And of course, that's completely flipped now. Democrats don't win in the South much. The Republicans pretty much dominate the South now, because even at this point, during the 1960 election, most of these Democrats in the South were very conservative Democrats. Here's a great photo taken of that televised march where the protesters were attacked. As you can see, that young man being attacked by the dogs is keeping his hands down. He's not even defending himself. And that was one of the important things about protesting during the civil rights era, is you could never use violence, not even in retaliation, because that would always be turned on you and would be used as justification for the attacks. So you never wanted to have any physical evidence, video evidence, photographic evidence of a protester either defending himself against or attacking a police officer, even in self-defense. Here's a great photo of sit-ins, sitting at a counter asking to be served. Some college students in North Carolina, of course, being refused service, so they just continue to sit there. And of course, I always find the most important part, and the thing that always strikes me, is the guy working behind the counter, probably understands and appreciates what they're trying to do, and would probably like to serve them, but he can't. And so he's probably very conflicted. I imagine him being very conflicted because he needs his job. And anyway, foreign affairs during the 1960s. You have the Bay of Pigs disaster. Basically, when Fidel Castro overthrew the government in Cuba and took over and implemented a socialist regime. Of course, many Cubans fled specifically to Miami, to Florida, because they were threatened and they feared for their lives. They were generally supportive of the American kind of puppet government that had existed prior. Well, they had constantly wanted to get Castro out. And so they began with, under Eisenhower, a plan to really kind of not without Eisenhower's knowledge early on the planning stages, but the CIA had planned an invasion, or were planning an invasion of Cuba at a place called Bay of Pigs. And then, and so this was going on under Eisenhower's presidency, this plan. And then when Kennedy took over the presidency, it was already kind of, in action. Well, the actual invasion hadn't happened yet, but the planning and the preparation had been in the works for a little while. And so eventually they went ahead and with Kennedy not wanting to, but kind of having to approve the actual invasion. And they wanted to keep it secret, so it was a secret mission. But what had happened was that while they were training, word got out, and people in Miami and Castro himself learned about it, and so was basically prepared. And so when they landed at the Bay of Pigs on the island of Cuba, basically it was a trap, and they were stuck there. And Kennedy warned them before they left. He said, "Look, if you get in trouble, we can't really send help because we have to say that we didn't know it was happening." But anyway, the CIA called for help, to the military, and of course that's Kennedy's call. He's the commander in chief, and he refused to send in help. And those people died and were captured, and so the CIA were very angry about this, and they likely held a grudge. And many people argue that it was this failure to defend and help the CIA, of course, leads to the conspiracy theory that they're the ones that were actually behind the assassination of President Kennedy. But it was a humiliating foreign affairs crisis for Kennedy. Another foreign affairs crisis during his presidency was the Cuban Missile Crisis. It turned out a little better. But basically, we had some spy planes flying over Cuba, and we saw that they had the Soviet Union had delivered missiles to Cuba that could launch atomic warheads into the United States. And so these were missiles capable of carrying these atomic bombs. And of course, Cuba is 90 miles from Miami, so there's really no time to respond to an attack. So basically, when this was found out, Kennedy convened his advisors. He had a bunch of people listen to him. What a good president does is listen to all of his advisors, take all the information and make a decision. Well, he had some that said, on one end, said, let's just negotiate. We don't want to start a crisis. We don't want to, start World War III. So let's negotiate with the Soviet Union, negotiate with Cuba, and get these missiles out. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, you had those in his administration that said, let's just bomb Cuba. Let's just use an atomic bomb and make it a parking lot, basically. Well, he kind of fell somewhere in the middle after listening to all the different sides and decided to blockade or quarantine Cuba. So he used the U.S. Navy and basically put the naval ships all the way around Cuba to prevent anything from going in or going out. Well, the Soviet Union traded a lot with Cuba, and they had ships on the way to deliver goods, and along with them they had warships that were highly weaponized, obviously. And so the great fear was that what happens when the Soviet warships meet the American warships off the coast of Cuba. And so when this does happen, we enter what will be called the Cuban Missile Crisis. And many historians argue that this is the closest that we've actually ever came to World War III. because it was, young John F. Kennedy, been in office a little over a year, going nose to nose with a guy named the Soviet leader named Nikita Khrushchev, who was a crusty old guy who thought he could intimidate Kennedy and bully his way to winning this. But Kennedy stood firm, did not rescind his order to blockade Cuba. Khrushchev was threatening and belligerent, but eventually they were able to negotiate out of it, because neither one wanted an atomic war or a nuclear war. And basically, in order to save face, of course, the Soviets and the Cubans had to get rid of their missiles, but in order for Khrushchev to go back and save face and say he could got something out of it, the United States agreed in return for removing the missiles from Cuba that they would remove some old missiles that they had at ready in Turkey along the borders of the Soviet Union. So at least Khrushchev could go back, because you don't want, at least your enemy when you know Khrushchev, and you don't want him completely humiliated when he goes back, because you might be dealing with somebody worse. So the Cuban Missile Crisis was averted, but it was for about 2 weeks the world was on edge. Now Vietnam, as we remember, we had sent advisors to try to prevent the expansion of communism. And one of the problems was the leaders, including the earliest leaders, and then No Dinh Diem. These were basically puppet leaders for the United States and the West in South Vietnam, and most of them were not very good. They were either ignorant or oppressive to certain aspects of the population, and never really knew how to properly lead. And so they began, changing leadership, and actually the United States actually, if not doing it themselves, they tacitly supported the assassination of one of the Vietnam leaders of South Vietnam, of their own country that they were supporting. But then eventually, advisors were sent to Vietnam to support the South. There were 16,000. Now, when I say advisors, these are basically intelligence people, either Army intelligence or CIA people, to try to train the South Vietnamese to fight the communist North Vietnamese encroaching on them. And like I said, the U.S. supported the overthrow and the assassination of Diem, which would lead to more turnover and a very difficult time finding qualified, successful leaders. So with all these things going on, and Vietnam right at it, getting ready to really get involved in Vietnam, John F. Kennedy, on the trip to Dallas, driving in his vehicle with the top down, is assassinated in the car, and on November 22nd, 1963, just a few hours afterwards, a man named Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested and accused of the crime of killing the president. Of course, he had a background of communist sympathies. He had lived in the Soviet Union for a little while, and he was married to a Russian woman. So it seemed very convenient and kind of a perfect person to pin the blame on. But and of course, he was a celebrity. I mean, in a negative sense. And so the cameras were following him around, and of course he famously said he's just a patsy, that it wasn't him. And then a couple of days after he was arrested, he was being transported somewhere else, and in the garage of a building in Dallas, a man named Jack Ruby came up to him, with a handgun and killed him. And so if he was a patsy, he could never say, who, why, or how, or give proof. And of course, all of these things have led to, multiple conspiracy theories that, it wasn't, the lone, quote unquote, lone gunman of Lee Harvey Oswald that killed President Kennedy. And I think most Americans believe that it wasn't a lone gunman of Lee Harvey Oswald that killed President Kennedy. In my mind, at least, it was all too clean and all too well packaged to be that way. but there was some conspiracy. And as I mentioned earlier, the CIA, some people argue that's conspiracy. Some people argue it was the mafia because Kennedy had his brother crack down on the mafia. There are those that argue that it's a more modern, some say the Soviets that did it, and even a more modern conspiracy theory is that supposedly Kennedy was about to go public with knowledge of the U.S. space program and the fact that they had been in contact with aliens, and was going to expose some of the stuff they found at the Roswell site as being legitimate alien contact. So I mean, there's just all kinds of crazy theories that have been going around, and who knows? I mean, we'll probably never ever know. Who really either killed Oswald? Killed Kennedy, or had it done. Now, with Kennedy assassinated and gone, that means the Vice President of the United States will take over. And the Vice President was a man named Lyndon Baines Johnson. And he was a Texan, and he was one of the most powerful senators of all time. I mean, he had been in Congress and in the Senate for many, many years. He was very influential, and one of the reasons he was chosen as Vice President is to help Kennedy hold the South and win the South. And so when he was elected, when he took office, the civil rights people, those that had embraced Kennedy and civil rights and had been very hopeful when Kennedy said he was going to support civil rights legislation, they may not have been very sure about the path forward, because Johnson, being a Texan and a Southerner, but was coming into office. But he was a New Deal Democrat, and he was one of the few that when they filibustered, not filibuster, in the future he will filibuster, or he will, let me just scratch what I just said, I'm thinking about something else. But anyway, so Kennedy had initially, before he died, wanted to implement some tax cuts, and so Johnson continues that. Of course, the country's in mourning, and so most of the members of Congress are going to do what Johnson wants to do, out of respect for Kennedy. But one of the things that was really going to be controversial was the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which is basically a law passed by the federal government that makes it illegal to discriminate nationwide. Basically, if you're involved in interstate commerce, you can't discriminate nationwide based on race, religion, gender. And so basically, a non-discrimination law. And there was heavy resistance in the South to this law, and Johnson, of course, pushed for it. And there was a filibuster, meaning the Senate. In the Senate, you can do something called filibuster, which means you can, if you're against a law that's potentially going to be passed, you can talk to prevent a vote from coming forward. And so you can talk, and then somebody else can talk, and it's called a filibuster, and it's just basically a delaying tactic. Well, there was like a long filibuster against the Civil Rights Act, but Johnson, pressured through his pressure and influence, was able to end the filibuster and eventually get the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed. Also, one of the important things that Lyndon Johnson wanted to do was the war on poverty. He saw poverty as a major problem nationwide, and of course, in a lot of people's minds, the economic situations tied in with the segregation and the inability of many minority groups in America to find good-paying jobs. There's Lyndon Johnson taking the oath of office on Air Force One after Kennedy was assassinated, and standing beside him is Jackie Kennedy, John F. Kennedy's wife, former First Lady. With all this going on, we have the election of 1964. The Republicans, they choose a man named Barry Goldwater, and he's a very conservative person. He is a very, what we would call a war hawk, meaning that he's very vehemently anti-communist and wants to wage war if necessary wherever there is a communist threat, including Vietnam. And he is very vocal in his support of using the military against the Soviet Union and against the communists in Vietnam. Johnson is more resistant to, or at least early on, to this. And one of the ads that he runs is one of those controversial political ads in American political history. And it's called the Daisy Girl ad. And I don't have a video of it right now, but I encourage you to go Google Daisy Girl ad and just watch it. It's a short little ad, but it will scare the heck out of you. Basically, it's and you have to imagine, people at home at 7 o'clock in 1964, watching TV with the family, little kids and grandma and grandpa and everybody else, and all of a sudden an ad comes on that shows a little girl picking daisies and counting, and as she's counting the daisies, they equate that to counting down a bombing, and then once the bombing happens, it shows in the background the little girl's eyes a reflection of an atomic bomb going off, and and I'm paraphrasing, but in the end it says, Johnson basically says, assuming that Goldwater is going to start a war, he said, we must all love each other or we must die. And it just freaked everybody out. And the ad only showed once, but it's the most famous political ad in American history. But please go Google and watch the Daisy Girl ad on YouTube. It's on YouTube, so you can watch it there. Anyway, Johnson, once he became president, wanted to implement something called the Great Society. That was the name of his program. Of course, Franklin Roosevelt had the New Deal. Truman had the Fair Deal. So if there's a test question about this, Lyndon Johnson's program was the Great Society. He wanted to solve nationwide problems. That was his goal. While historically, the New Deal and things like that tried to solve problems on a state-by-state basis, he saw nationwide problems like health care for the elderly, which led to the creation of Medicare. Problems with young children not being prepared for school, not having access to preschool, and of course he created under the Great Society the preschool programs, what they call the Head Start programs, to give children an opportunity that maybe didn't come from educated families to kind of be prepared with preschool for entering into school. The Head Start program, Housing and Urban Development Act helped try to solve some of those problems that were talked about in the 50s about urban poverty and the inability to find jobs and housing. Safety standards for automobiles prior to the Great Society. There were no rules regarding ensuring that automobiles that you drive were safe. So, I mean, and famously, there was a famous automobile called the Ford Pinto, whose gas tank was situated in the back, and basically, sometimes if you get rear-ended in your Ford Pinto at 30 miles an hour, it would explode like a bomb because of there was no safety protections for the car, and really no rules. And so safety standards were put in place, then were enforced by the government. Immigration and Nationality Services Act of 1965 basically made it easier for immigrants from non-traditional countries to get here. If you remember going back in previous units, we talked about, and especially in times of nativism, that they would find ways and pass laws that would limit immigration from basically all countries except like Western Europe, England, Ireland, France, Scotland, and there were quotas for how many could come from all countries, and usually the most could come from those countries. Well, basically, in order to change that and to make it fair, this law implemented hemispheric quotas. So you had the Western Hemisphere, the Eastern Hemisphere, the Southern Hemisphere, and the Northern Hemisphere, and there would be quotas from. You could have so many from each hemisphere, which would encompass multiple nations, and made the immigration system much fairer. So all of these things were attempts by Lyndon Johnson to improve what he saw as nationwide problems. Assessing Johnson's Great Society, one of the problems, and historically you look back, it was just very expensive. The things he tried to do and create just cost a lot of money. led to debt, led to deficit spending, and for the money, it generally did too little. The successes probably were Medicare, Medicaid, which provides health care, which was in short supply for a lot of people, as it is somewhat today. Consumer rights, meaning protections against producers of things that produce dangerous goods. Health, Head Start was considered a success in helping young children prepare for school. But as I mentioned, costs was one of the big problems, and the fact that in order to help the poor, a lot of these welfare programs that were put into place created in some people a dependency on welfare, taking away their motivation to work. Also, Voting Rights Act of 1965, providing federal oversight of state elections, because in the South especially, even though discrimination was supposedly outlawed, there were still kind of attempts to prevent African Americans and Hispanics and from either registering to vote or voting itself. And so the federal government would go down and watch the elections to ensure that they were done fairly. Also during this time, during the 60s, especially into the late 60s, you're going to see a faction of the civil rights movement that's going to break away from Martin Luther King, and they're specifically going to break away from his belief in and his demand for nonviolence and just civil disobedience. And it's going to be called the Black Power movement. And basically, they're going to argue that there's no way that American society is going to accept Black America fully equally, and especially in a peaceful transition. That if we're going to, if the Black community is going to have any type of equality or any kind of protection, they're going to have to do it themselves. And so it run the gamut from policing their own communities outside of the normal police force, because the police force were accused of perpetrating violence upon the community, and some people argued for complete separation. And it led to riots in the streets, and a lot of it was tied to the poverty issue, the fact that much of America was prospering except the inner city and these areas that there were no job opportunities. And so you see the Watts riots and other riots in other cities. Watts was in Los Angeles, I believe. Most African Americans during this time were living, at least those in the cities, were living in a cycle of poverty, where they just, they may want to work. Both parents may work, but they were just unable to work if the jobs they did have didn't pay very much. And then, of course, if they had children, they couldn't afford daycare or babysitters. So one of the people that maybe was working couldn't work anymore. So it was this cycle that you get into of poverty. Another complaint of the Black Power movement was that a highly disproportionate number of African Americans, percentage-wise, were serving in Vietnam as opposed to the percentage in the population. And they're going to make the argument that just like historically it's been made over many years and throughout history, not just in America but throughout the world, that the elites and the wealthy start the war, and the masses, the poor, fight the war. And so they argue that well African Americans may make up 12% of the population. They're 40% or whatever of the people fighting in the war. And so during this time, the group called the Black Panthers is formed. It's a very radical group that called for self-police, that didn't reject violence, called for separatism, led by a guy named Stokely Carmichael. So if I mentioned Stokely Carmichael's name, you might want to know that he's part of the Black Power movement, the Black Panthers. Also part of the Black Power movement was a man named Malcolm X. Wasn't his real name, but he changed his name because basically most African Americans that have ancestors going back to slavery, their last names are the names of their masters or their owners. So he rejected that, and so he just placed an X after his name, because saying he doesn't have a last name because it was taken from him. But anyway, he was a petty criminal. He was a troublemaker. But and eventually he was put in prison. While he was in prison, he converted to Islam. He started speaking to people that were of Islamic heritage, and he converted to Islam. And he became a radicalized Muslim, calling for separation, and saw, based on these Muslims in American prisons, saw white people as the enemy. And so this was his kind of radical point of view for a long time. And then and he was joined what's called the Nation of Islam. But if you know anything about Islam, one of the requirements of being a Muslim is you have to go to Mecca in the Middle East, in Saudi Arabia, and as a pilgrimage as part of it. And so he decided to do this after he got out of prison. And when he got over there, he was shocked to see that it wasn't just black people as Muslims making the pilgrimage. There were white people from all over the world, and there were people from Asia and everything. And it really fundamentally changed how he viewed his own religion and his own country. And so he rejected the radicalism of the Nation of Islam and this kind of anti-white attitude about the Nation of Islam, and went back and he worked in a more productive and peaceful kind of way to put forth his faith. And of course he was assassinated as well. And many people argue that it was the Nation of Islam in America that assassinated him because he did reject their radical teachings. That is a picture of Malcolm X.